My name is Adelaide, and I am 39 years old. For 12 solid years, I sat at the mahogany desk in the corner. You will never understand a single entry in this ledger, Garrett said to me one Tuesday morning. A small tin box rested on the shelf above my head, heavy with forgotten receipts. The columns of figures stretched downward in neat black ink, demanding absolute precision from every single digit recorded on the paper. Garrett stood by the window with his hands folded behind his back. People always assumed the quietest person in the room was simply waiting for permission to speak. They were quite mistaken about that mistake. I measured my life in rows and columns, balancing every penny while the household slowly fell apart. Hollies walked past the front porch carrying a crate of empty bottles. Nobody ever looked too closely at the exact way the accounts were managed. Every debit had to match a credit down to the very final fraction of a cent. Let me ask you to do something simple. Subscribe and stay right here with me so you can find out what was tucked away inside that tin box. This is not one of those stories full of screaming and slammed doors. It is calmer than that and colder. A quiet reckoning, built one small piece at a time. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, because I genuinely like to know. The office desk was made of oak. Ink stayed pooled in my ceramic well. Every receipt required a signature. Every margin demanded clean precision. My work followed strict rules. Errors hiding in a column always surfaced eventually. The process taught a specific patience. Garrett lived entirely outside those rules. He operated on noise and broad gestures. Breakfast biscuits sat on his plate while he talked over everyone. His authority rested on volume rather than proof. I preferred the quiet reality of the ledger. Columns did not care who shouted loudest. They only recorded what was actually present. 12 years of checking columns built a steady armor. My hands stayed calm over the paper. The afternoon light cut sharp across the wooden floor. Waynesboro winters brought a biting draft through the window seals. I pulled my wool sweater tighter around my shoulders. Nothing rushed my pace. Each entry stood alone. A column of figures told a complete story to anyone willing to look closely enough. The foundation of the house rested on these quiet habits. Every single transaction left a mark behind. I sat at my desk. The room smelled of old paper and damp wool. My name is Adelaide, and I spent my days keeping the records straight. People in Waynesboro believed things happened because someone shouted loud enough. Garrett lived by this creed every single day. He believed that whoever stood at the head of the table owned everything. The household ran on an unspoken law. It was written nowhere, yet everyone obeyed without question. In the Vance household, what was preserved through quiet calculation belonged by public decree. It belonged to whoever spoke loudest about paternal sacrifice. Garrett mastered this performance early. He played the part of the suffering provider. Hollies watched from the corner, saying nothing to alter the script. Garrett made sure his voice echoed through every room. He banged his fork against his ceramic plate during Sunday dinner. He talked about his burdens until neighbors looked at him with genuine pity. My green ledger remained open on the sideboard near the window. I recorded every single expense down to the last copper coin. Nobody ever looked at those pages. They looked at Garrett instead. They believed his daily volume was absolute proof of his labor. This unspoken rule made the coming humiliation feel entirely normal to everyone else. When Garrett claimed public credit for work he never touched, the family nodded. To them, the loudest voice always held the true title to the room. My silence was treated as proof of nothing at all. I turned the page with my blue pen and kept working. The dark ink dried slowly under the pale afternoon light. Hollies sat across from me on most afternoons. He whittled small pieces of pine wood with a pocket knife. He never argued with Garrett. He knew how the house operated. He understood that survival meant agreeing with whoever held the carving knife. Hollies gave me a sideways glance once in a while. He did not offer any comfort. He simply swept the wood shavings into his palm and dropped them. My pen moved in steady, calculated rows across the paper. I logged receipts and sorted old invoices from the hardware store. Every single column remained pristine and untouched by chaos. Garrett walked past my oak desk and dropped a heavy hand. He told me I worried far too much about minor details. He laughed at my quiet habits and walked away. The family watched him and smiled. They thought his dominance was a permanent law of nature. That unwritten belief was the foundation of everything that followed here. It made outright theft look like simple stewardship. It made hard work look like charity handed down from above. Nobody ever questioned the man who shouted from the porch. They only questioned the person who quietly asked for proof. I kept my head down and kept writing. The columns did not care who yelled the loudest. They only waited for the truth to be entered. The afternoon wore on. Long shadows lengthened across the worn wooden floorboards. Garrett left the room to check his old truck outside. Hollis packed his pocketknife away in his wool coat pocket. The house fell into a brief and heavy silence. I closed my inkwell and wiped my nib with a clean cloth. The rule remained firmly in place. I prepared myself for what the next page would demand from me. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the wooden floor. Garrett walked into the room with heavy boots. He adjusted his woolen collar with a rough hand and dropped a worn leather folder squarely on the wooden table top. Hollis followed closely behind him with slow steps. Hollis held an old tin box under his arm. That small container rattled quietly with loose metal parts. Garrett looked down at the desk with narrowed eyes. "You are working too late again," Garrett said to the corner of the room. I kept my pencil still and stared at the grain of the oak. Hollis set the tin box down near the edge of the table. The rusted hinges clicked softly against the wood. My father kept his old letters inside that container years ago. Hollis muttered something about the damp air outside. Garrett did not care about the damp air. He reached out and tapped the ledger with a thick finger. Hollis wiped his palms on his trousers and looked around the room. 67 years of hard labor had left his shoulders permanently rounded. He leaned against the empty bookshelf by the door. "Everything is accounted for, Adelaide," Hollis said in a quiet voice. I looked up from my green book and met his gaze. Garrett grunted and crossed his arms over his chest. 64 years of demanding absolute obedience from everyone around him had taught him how to completely fill any given room easily. The room felt smaller with both of them standing so close to my desk. Garrett spat out a sharp complaint about the utility bills. I did not answer him right away. Silence was often the only ledger entry that mattered. Hollis looked down at his own boots and stayed quiet. The tin box sat undisturbed between us on the polished oak. Garrett reached out and pushed the metal container aside with his thumb. It slid across the grain and bumped against the ceramic ink well. That tin box held secrets that belonged to a different era entirely. My father had carefully stored his private family correspondence inside its rusted metal walls long before anyone else claimed this house. Hollis watched the metal box with a strange sort of worry in his eyes. He cleared his throat and shifted his weight to his left foot. "We have enough trouble without digging into the past," Hollis said softly. Garrett laughed a harsh sound that lacked any real amusement. He slammed his palm against the edge of the writing desk. "You worry too much about ghosts," Garrett said to the old man. I kept my blue pen poised above the paper without making a mark. The ink stayed wet in the ceramic well while they argued. The room smelled of stale tobacco and cold iron from the hearth. Garrett paced back and forth across the old wooden floorboards with loud, heavy strides that rattled the ceramic ink well slightly. Every movement he made was designed to look larger than life itself. Hollis shrank back toward the wall as the older man turned around. I turned a page in my green ledger to check the column totals. The numbers had to align precisely before the evening audit could conclude. Garrett stopped his pacing and pointed a stubby finger right at my book. "Make sure those receipts are entered properly before morning comes," Garrett said loudly. I nodded once without looking up from the fine blue lines. Hollis stared at his worn boots and kept his mouth shut tight. The silence returned as soon as Garrett walked toward the front hallway. The old legacy artifact rested quietly beneath a thick pile of dusty old tax forms inside the bottom desk drawer today. I touched the corner of the worn leather binder when Garrett finally left the room. Hollis remained standing by the door like an old dog waiting for a command. He did not have the strength to challenge anything that happened under this roof. 67 years had worn away whatever defiance he once possessed in his youth. I closed the green book slowly and set my blue pen down in the wooden groove. Waynesboro winters always brought a bitter chill through the loose window panes. The tin box remained on the oak table where Hollis had placed it earlier. I reached out and traced the rusted metal latch with my index finger. Nothing was truly lost, as long as the paper trail remained completely intact. Every single entry waited patiently for the proper day of reckoning to arrive. Sunbeams slanted through the dirty window glass over the sink. Dust motes drifted lazily while he turned a page. Garrett stood firmly at the head of the heavy oak table while holding a leather-bound ledger in his thick, calloused fingers. He cleared his throat loudly before speaking to the silent room. Adelaide brought the heavy stoneware platter closer to the center of the scarred boards. Nobody else dared to move a single muscle in the tense room. You could hear the old wall clock ticking against the plaster. The family watched him wait for absolute quiet before dropping the green book onto the wood with a sharp thud. "This work you keep doing is entirely useless," he said to the empty air. She did not look up from the ceramic plate. Garrett tapped his heavy ring against the margin of the open page. Adelaide kept her hands flat against her linen napkin while stubbornly refusing to look up from the chipped ceramic plate. "You pretend these columns matter more than they do," he said. "The numbers balance only because I allow them to balance," he said. Hollis shifted his weight on the wooden bench near the door. Garrett leaned forward until his shirt sleeves brushed the salt cellar. The kitchen felt suddenly smaller under his heavy gaze, while every other person at the table stared hard at their food. "You have no idea how real work operates," he said with a sneer. Nobody offered a word to soften the sharp edge of his tone. Garrett smiled without any warmth reaching his pale eyes. Adelaide breathed through her nose, without making a sound, while the silence stretched across the room like a cold wire. "You are just keeping score for a game you cannot win," he said. Garrett closed the ledger with a deliberate and heavy motion. He expected everyone to nod along with his grand performance today. The long afternoon shadows grew slowly across the linoleum floor, while a tired bluebottle fly buzzed against the dirty windowpane. The family law demanded submission from anyone who sat quietly. Garrett stood up and pushed his chair back with a scrape. He walked toward the dark hallway without another glance backward. Adelaide slowly picked up her silver fork and set it back down, while the metal made no sound against the old wood. The humiliation stayed hanging in the stale air. Adelaide stared at the grain of the wooden tabletop. The lines of the wood looked like dry riverbeds. The old walls of the farmhouse absorbed every harsh word he spoke, while years of practice taught the house how to listen carefully. "You will understand your place eventually," he had shouted once before. Nobody ever challenged the man who held the purse strings in this house. Adelaide kept her mouth shut and watched the empty chair. Hollis cleared his throat and looked down at his worn boots because the older man never interfered when Garrett built steam. The ink in her small bottle stayed dark and still. Garrett had left his heavy coffee mug sitting near the salt. A brown stain ringed the bottom of the unwashed porcelain. The kitchen lamp flickered once as a cold draft found a small crack in the warped wooden window frame. Adelaide reached out with a cloth and wiped the surface clean. Every error had a destination if you only looked closely. Adelaide picked up the green book Garrett had left behind. She opened the cover to examine the sloppy arithmetic inside. The old house settled into a temporary and fragile quietness, while outside the window the pasture stretched toward the gray tree line. "You write like a clerk who knows nothing of power," he had told her. She did not pull it out or cry about the pain. She simply noted the angle and kept breathing in the dust. That sentence remained lodged in her mind like a wooden splinter while she did not pull it out or cry. The ledger pages waited for a better hand to guide them. Time moved forward without asking for permission from anyone here. The morning light came through the frosted glass. It did not warm the floor. I walked to my desk without speaking. Garrett sat at his table. He ate a dry biscuit. He chewed with his mouth open. I did not look his way. My silence was a quiet room. 12 years of habit made my fingers move. I opened the top drawer. I reached past the paper clips. I pulled out a small tin box. It was green once. The paint had chipped near the rim. I set it beside the blotter. This tin box became my new anchor. I placed a receipt inside. It was not the official one. It was the scrap Garrett tossed aside last week. The blue ink was wrong. The project code did not match. I kept it safe under the metal lid. Hollis walked past the window. His boots dragged on the gravel. He paused near the coal shed. He looked inside. He did not come inside the front office. He knew the air in here was thin. He turned away and walked toward the fence. Garrett tossed a paper onto my stack. He did not say my name. He merely tapped his finger on the wood. I pulled the papers toward me. I checked the figures. The totals were wrong by a wide margin. I wrote the correct sum. I did not tell him about the error. Telling him required a bridge I no longer wished to cross. Let the columns drift. Let the totals slip off balance. I stored my spare pencils inside the tin box. I closed the lid until it clicked. The withdrawal happened without a sound. People do not always slam doors when they leave. Sometimes they just stop offering their warmth. They sit in the same room. They do the required work. They keep their thoughts behind a locked door. Garrett cleared his throat loudly. He wanted me to fetch fresh coffee from the back room. I stayed in my chair. I pretended to study an old tax form. He stood up with a grunt. He walked to the pot himself. He grumbled about the cold water. I turned a page in the ledger. The paper made a dry whisper against the desk. My hands did not shake. They were steady. 12 years of discipline teaches a person how to vanish in plain sight. Inside the metal box, the spare receipts accumulated. They formed a quiet stack of evidence. Nobody else looked inside that box. Garrett assumed all containers belonged to his domain. He missed the small shifts in the room entirely. Waynesboro mornings stayed bitter. The frost clung to the windows. Inside, the space grew colder still. Not from the weather, from the distance between our desks. The silence settled like dust over the inkwells. I slid the tin container into the bottom drawer. I pushed the drawer shut. The metal latch fell into place. I reached for my pen. There were more columns to verify before the noon hour arrived. I focused on my labor and remained out of sight. The old black ledger rested under the desk. I did not touch it during the morning hours. Garrett sat across the room. He hummed a tuneless song. It was a habit he used when he felt secure in his dominance. Security makes people careless. They stop checking the small details. They assume every column bends to their will. Garrett believed his voice was enough to make reality conform. He forgot that numbers require proof, not just volume. I placed 3 more slips of paper into the tin container. Each slip told a different story than the official file. Each discrepancy pointed toward $42,500. That sum sat quietly in the secondary log, waiting for the right moment. Hollis peered through the glass again. His face looked tired in the gray light. He pressed his palm against the pane. He wanted to say something. He swallowed his words and lowered his hand. He stepped back into the shadow of the overhang. Nobody offered a rescue in this house. You learn to build your own shelter out of ledgers and ink. I locked the drawer and pocketed the small key. The iron key felt heavy against my palm. I turned back to the blank page. Let me ask you before I go on. Was there ever a person who looked right past you, who treated your patience as permission to take more than their share? Mine did, for years. If you recognize that feeling, I would be grateful if you left a comment about it. Knowing you are out there, listening and nodding along, makes telling this a little easier. Winter mornings arrived with frost on the glass. I sat at the oak desk in the cold room. My fingers gripped a wooden pen holder. Dark ink bled into the grain of the paper. The stove in the corner crackled twice before dying down. Outside, gray light spread across the gravel lot. Garrett walked past the window in his heavy coat. He paused to kick a frozen rut with his boot. He did not look inside. I dipped the nib back into the ceramic well. Another column waited for my hand. Years accrued without ceremony or noise. Summer brought dust through the warped screen door. Sweat dried on the back of my neck. The ledger remained open on the surface. Page followed page with silent regularity. Receipts accumulated inside the metal container in the lower recess. Each slip of paper carried a faded stamp. Some showed timber sales from the North Acreage. Others recorded grain shipments hauled by Hollis. Garrett signed his name with a heavy flourish. His pen left deep indents on the surface below. He trusted the noise of his own voice. He assumed memory would soften the margins. Paper held a sharper memory than any man. I smoothed a crumpled freight invoice with my palm. The edges were frayed from frequent handling. I slipped it into the tin box. The small iron key turned with a dry click. Hollis walked by the fence line on Tuesdays. He carried a coil of rusted wire over his shoulder. He nodded once toward the office window. I returned the gesture through the dirty glass. Neither of us spoke a word. The routine settled into the marrow of my bones. Every receipt found its proper place. Nothing was lost to careless habit. The ink dried darker as the months turned. Spring arrived with heavy rains that beat against the southern windows of the office. Water pooled in the driveway, ruts near the rusted tractor frame. Garrett drove his truck through the mud, without slowing down for the puddles. Mud splattered against the whitewashed siding of the small storage shed outside. Every season brought its own bundle of papers to sort and file. Spring receipts documented seed purchases from the regional supply store downtown. Each invoice bore a stamped signature in blue ink from the manager. I took each slip and laid it flat on the wooden surface. The damp air made the paper pages curl at the sharp corners. Before I placed the heavy brass paperweight firmly upon them, summer heat settled over Waynesboro with a thick and suffocating weight. The office windows stayed shut to keep out the stinging yellow jackets. Dust motes danced in the slanted shafts of bright afternoon sunlight. I opened the metal box to file away a stack of freight bills. $42,500 in disputed transactions rested quietly in the dark. That sum did not speak its name to anyone passing through the room. Garrett walked past on his way to check the irrigation pipes outside. He wiped sweat from his forehead with a stained canvas handkerchief. He dropped a bundle of crumpled receipts onto the edge of my table. "These need filing by Friday morning," he said without looking at me. I nodded once and placed the papers inside the lower drawer compartment. The heavy iron key rested securely in my palm, while the midday heat pressed against the glass with unrelenting intensity. Autumn brought rust colors to the maple trees along the property line. Hollies stopped by the fence with a weathered wooden crate of apples. He set the crate down near the porch steps for the household cook. Garrett came out to meet him carrying a thick leather notebook. They argued about pasture leases near the creek bed for 20 minutes. I watched them through the dusty window pane from my usual seat inside. Every transaction had a twin somewhere in my hidden metal box. The numbers grew larger with every harvest, and every cattle auction held. Every single financial column in the primary ledger remained entirely accurate, while the men outside argued about boundaries they no longer controlled. Winter returned with pale skies and frozen ground that resisted the plow. The stovepipe rattled whenever the north wind swept across the gravel yard. I pulled my wool sweater closer around my shoulders against the drafts. My pen moved across the white page with a quiet scraping sound. Years accumulated like layers of sediment at the bottom of a lake. Garrett still sat at the head of the walnut dining table. He still spoke louder than everyone else when the family gathered together. He firmly believed his loud voice protected him from the quiet accounting that took place just feet away from his boots. Night fell quickly over the valley as the temperature dropped below freezing. The small desk lamp cast a pale circle of light across my papers. I turned the page and reviewed the totals for the third quarter. Every entry matched the receipts locked inside the secure metal container. Nothing was missed, and nothing was forgiven by the silent columns. The dark office held its breath while the hours ticked onward into evening. The simple daily act of keeping accurate records became my absolute private shield against the loud theater playing out upstairs. And the final numerical tally waited quite patiently for the proper moment to emerge into the sharp morning daylight. The morning sun hit the window pane with cold force. I sat at my oak desk in the small office. The green ledger lay open before my eyes. The columns of figures were neat and exact, but the totals carried a hidden burden. The family fiction began to fray at the edges. Small discrepancies showed up like loose threads on a woolen coat. Garrett walked into the room without his usual noise. His boots made a heavy sound against the floorboards. He carried a stack of grain receipts in his right hand. He dropped the papers onto the edge of my desk, staring at the ruled lines as if they were written in a strange language. He pulled out the wooden chair and sat down slowly. His shoulders slumped forward under the weight of 64 years of farm labor. He rubbed his knuckles with his left thumb, wincing against the persistent ache in his joints. His reading glasses were smudged with dust from the tractor shed. He took a gray handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the lenses with trembling fingers. For a brief moment, the bluster vanished entirely from his face. He looked tired, vulnerable, and unmistakably old. He was just a man past his prime, struggling to keep his balance in a world that was moving too fast for him. My chest tightened with a strange, quiet pity that I pushed away just as quickly. My eyes stayed on the ledger page. I dipped my metal nib into the ceramic inkwell. The ink flowed smoothly across the heavy paper. Garrett cleared his throat and looked up from his boots. "My records show no missing sums," he said, his voice lacking its old thunder. "Everything is accounted for, Adelaide," he added, though his tone carried an unmistakable edge of doubt. I did not answer him right away. I let the silence stretch across the room between us. The ledger entries told a story he refused to read. $42,500 sat buried in the machinery maintenance columns under false descriptions. He had written the checks himself during the previous autumn. He wanted to believe his own story of paternal sacrifice. The numbers refused to bend to his will anymore. Every receipt told the truth about what had left the farm accounts. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched the corner of the green book. His fingers brushed against the leather binding. He looked down at the desk, with a heavy sigh that smelled of stale tobacco and black coffee. He pulled his hand back quickly and placed it flat on his knee. Outside the window, Hollies walked past the fence line. The old neighbor carried a bundle of split cedar posts across his shoulder. He did not look in our direction. He kept his head down against the biting wind. The household outside this room was starting to feel the strain as well. Bills arrived with red past due stamps pressed against the margins. Creditors called the main house twice during the last week. Garrett had lied to them about the timber sales. He had promised funds that were already drained from the central account. The lie was getting too heavy for anyone to carry alone. He shifted his weight in the chair and adjusted his collar with a fumbling motion. I turned a fresh page in the ledger. The paper made a soft scratching sound in the quiet room. My pencil hovered over the debit column. I did not gloat over his discomfort. Triumph was a vulgar thing that belonged to people who needed an audience. I only wanted the truth to sit where the fiction had lived for so long. The columns did not care about pride. They only cared about what remained when the additions were finished. Garrett leaned back and closed his eyes for a long second. He rubbed the bridge of his nose where his glasses had left a red indentation. He looked less like an absolute ruler and more like a tenant facing an eviction he saw coming from a mile away. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling beams. The paint was peeling in long gray flakes near the chimney flue. He muttered something about the weather turning cold too early this year. I dipped my pen again and kept working. One more question before it all tips over. When someone has spent years telling you that you do not matter, what does it take for the truth to finally speak louder than they can? Tell me what you think in the comments. And stay with me, because the answer is closer than they ever imagined, and it had been sitting in plain sight the whole time. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. The wind rattled the window panes outside. It rested squarely on the center of the oak desk. Garrett brought it inside himself. His hands shook slightly against the rough brown paper. He dropped it near my ceramic ink well with a dull thud. Dust motes settled around the edges in the quiet corner of the room. You need to sign this document right now, Garrett said. I looked down at the heavy paper. It was a notarized statement. He had drafted it at the local town hall on Monday morning. He wanted my formal attestation on the official records. He wanted me to swear the accounts were completely clear. He wanted my signature at the bottom corner. I cannot sign that paper for you, I said. His face tightened into a hard glare. He leaned heavily over my workspace. Everything is accounted for under my direct supervision, Adelaide, Garrett said. I pulled my blue pen from the ceramic stand. I opened the green leather ledger slowly. The pages felt stiff beneath my calloused fingers. I did not raise my voice at all. I simply pointed to a specific financial entry from the spring columns. You missed a crucial ledger entry right here, I said. Garrett stared at the column of figures. His breathing grew shallow in the quiet room. His fingers twitched against his wool coat. He had signed his name to the formal statement. He had sworn to numbers that did not exist in reality. He had put his falsehoods into permanent ink. The notarized statement rested right beside my daily log. It listed profits that never entered our accounts. It claimed timber shipments that vanished before delivery. It covered the missing $42,500. It spelled out his entire financial scheme on paper. You wrote it all down yourself, I said. He stepped back from the oak table. The weight of his own words hit him hard. He had rushed to secure his position. He had rushed to silence any future doubt. He had overreached with a pen in hand. Holly stood quietly by the front window. He adjusted his collar with a slow motion. He watched the scene unfold from the gravel yard. He did not step inside the small room. He kept his distance near the glass frame. He saw the legal trap snap shut. You cannot undo this official filing now, I said. Garrett reached out for the brown envelope. I placed my hand flat against the corner. I kept my fingers steady on the green leather. The ink was dry on every single page. The dates matched the bank slips inside my tin box. This Waynesboro office held 10 years of truth. Every receipt sat in its proper filing folder. Every freight bill lined the metal drawer. Every ledger line bore the weight of unstated facts. The discrepancy stared back from the ruled lines. His signed paper matched the exact missing sum. You certified a complete lie on paper, I said. He did not offer a single word back. He offered no defense against the math. He turned his back on the oak desk. His boots made a heavy sound against the floorboards. He walked out toward the gravel driveway. He left the notarized statement right there. I closed the ledger with a quiet snap. The room fell silent except for the wind. Hollis walked away from the exterior window. I picked up my blue pen again. I drew a neat line beneath the entry. The ledger had witnessed 12 years of quiet labor. It held every error and every corrected sum. Garrett never understood the patience required for accounting. He only understood the volume of his own voice. Now his own signature condemned him. Inside the locked tin box rested the duplicate slips. The iron key hung safely on its usual hook. They proved every diversion of funds over the decade. The numbers remained stubborn and unyielding. They waited quietly for this exact confrontation. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the wooden floor. The silence between us felt heavier than any ledger book. Garrett knew he had overreached beyond repair. The record spoke for itself now. Nothing more needed to be added to the file. No shouting could change the written text. No family rule could erase the dated proof. The paper trail had finally closed the circle. Every entry waited for its final accounting. The country church hall smelled of old floor wax and damp winter wool. Dust motes drifted through the high arched windows above the altar. I carried the heavy green ledger under my left arm. Hollis stood near the doorway with his hands tucked deep into his pockets, while the morning wind rattled the glass panes. He held a small bundle of folded paper against his chest. Garrett sat at the front table alone. He looked smaller than he had at the farmhouse kitchen. The parish room felt remarkably drafty, despite the small radiator near the piano. Garrett did not look up when I pulled out the wooden chair. He cleared his throat and stared at the polished floorboards near his boots. "You brought a great deal of paperwork for a Tuesday morning meeting," he said. I placed the ledger flat against the grain of the oak table. Every single page carried a permanent trail of dark blue ink that he could never erase with his loud voice. Hollis walked slowly across the linoleum floor. He did not say a word to defend anyone in the room while the morning shadows lengthened across the floorboards. He laid a bundle of old letters on the corner of the table. "These belong to my father," Hollis said softly. He pushed the bundle toward Garrett without raising his tired eyes. The paper was yellowed and fragile at the edges from decades of neglect. They showed what the Vance family actually owned before the rules changed completely. Garrett reached out a trembling hand and touched the edge of the stack. His fingers brushed against the green cover of my ledger. I opened the locked tin box from my desk drawer. Inside sat 12 years of detailed receipts and freight bills collected carefully from every single corner of the county. Each sheet matched the entries in the primary book without a single error. "The numbers balance," I said quietly to the empty room. Garrett let out a long breath through his nose. He tried to straighten his shoulders against the back of the heavy chair. "You always made things harder than they needed to be," he said. I kept my hands resting flat against the scarred wooden table surface. The columns did not care about his pride or his loud voice. They only cared about what remained after the subtraction was finished by someone who actually understood the work. The afternoon light shifted across the boards. Hollis stepped back toward the shadow of the rear door. He stayed close enough to witness the ledger work without getting in the way. Garrett turned a page with a dry scraping sound. The dark ink did not lie about any of the missing funds or the forged signatures recorded in the margins. We sat in complete silence while the clock on the wall ticked away the seconds. Every single transaction from 1984 onward was carefully accounted for in precise blue ink by my own hand. Garrett looked down at his own notarized statement from the previous week with narrowed eyes. He saw how every single discrepancy aligned with the receipts inside my box. Nothing was missing from the official record now. The room felt entirely still as we waited for what came next in the quiet afternoon. We finally left the papers right where they were today. The office remained extraordinarily quiet after the morning meetings faded away completely. Sunlight traced bright patterns across the worn floorboards near the front counter. I placed the notarized paperwork inside the metal filing drawer with deliberate slowness. Garrett had signed his name at the bottom of those pages months ago when he still thought he held all the power. I held the complete proof of every missing penny inside my hands. The temptation to ruin him completely sat heavily upon my shoulders for several difficult hours. Many people in Waynesboro would have cheered to see an old tyrant brought down by simple math. Such a public collapse could have stripped him of his remaining dignity and every bit of property he claimed to own. I chose a completely different path, instead of seeking total destruction today. The thought of launching a legal crusade against a failing man felt remarkably hollow. Pursuing personal vengeance required an emotional energy I preferred to save for my own peace of mind. Let the bitter past remain where it belonged, without adding any more unnecessary noise to the quiet community outside our windows. Hollis walked past the front window earlier and nodded without stopping to chat. He understood the heavy weight of what we carried through those long years. He said nothing about punishment when our eyes met briefly through the glass. People always expected dramatic vengeance to follow a proven betrayal as naturally as freezing winter followed the golden autumn harvest. Restraint felt much colder than triumphant victory on a brisk afternoon like this. Workers often anticipated a theatrical confrontation when a wrong was finally measured and proven beyond doubt. That common expectation ignored the simple truth about working with financial records day after day. Administrative errors required proper professional correction rather than participating in any sort of noisy and exhausting public humiliation. Destroying Garrett publicly would not bring back the time spent correcting sloppy mistakes. Such a vindictive outcome only created entirely new administrative messes for someone else to sweep off the dusty office floor. I closed the heavy wooden drawer and locked the brass mechanism securely. Silence served as a much better boundary than any courtroom battle ever could provide. Letting go of retaliation was not an act of mercy meant for his personal benefit. I simply refused to spend another single day of my life tied directly to his endless and loud failures. My ledger remained accurate, my oak desk stayed clean, and the warm afternoon sunlight drifted across the empty room. Nothing more needed to be said about the matter. The heavy ceramic ink well sat undisturbed beside my pen holder on the polished oak surface. Years of quiet habit kept my hands steady as I packed away the stray receipts. True power lived in the ability to walk away from a useless fight. Nobody in this town ever needed a dramatic closing speech to understand that the disputed account was finally settled. Outside on the main street, horses' hooves echoed against the packed dirt road. The town continued its steady daily rhythm without pausing for our private reckonings. I quietly pulled my thick gray wool sweater closer around my shoulders against the evening chill of the fading daylight. Peace arrived without fanfare when a ledger balanced itself through sheer honesty and quiet work. The coal shed door stayed closed all morning. Waynesboro went about its business with the steady hum of trucks rolling down the lane while I sat at my wooden desk. The room smelled of old paper and black coffee. Garrett stayed in the back room behind his closed door. He had not emerged to dispute invoices or missing receipts. His steps sounded heavy and slow against the floorboards. Flipping to a fresh leaf in my working ledger, I reviewed the marginal notes. Around 12 o'clock, Holly strolled in front of the forward glass. He carried a small wooden crate instead of his usual heavy coal sack. He never knocked on the glass or stopped to look inside. He simply set the crate on the wooden porch while I watched him through the dusty front window pane. His shoulders looked lighter than they had in years of service. This subtle act served as his personal method of squaring things with yesteryear, while expecting zero compensation. I stepped outside to retrieve the box. The wood was rough and smelled strongly of pine resin. Inside sat a bundle of tied envelopes with faded postage stamps from decades ago. These were my late father's personal letters. Garrett had kept them hidden away, inside a dark back cupboard, ever since the family estate was formally divided among us. Hollis must have found them behind the old shelving unit during his chores. Prior dampness blurred the writing on the uppermost mail piece. I carried the crate back to my desk. I cut the twine with a small pair of dull office scissors. The paper felt fragile beneath my fingertips. My father wrote in a neat cursive hand about the spring planting and the recurring cost of agricultural seed each year. Every sentence reflected a man who believed in honest labor above all else. None of his words mentioned power or public display. He simply recorded what he grew and what he owed each season, nothing more. I read through 3 of the pages before the afternoon bell rang at the town hall. The written words offered no grand cinematic revelations about human nature or the strict traditions of local family law. They merely mapped out an ordinary life built on modest truths. I placed the letters inside my bottom drawer next to the blank journals. I closed the drawer and turned the brass key once. The metal felt cool and solid against my thumb. Garrett remained silent behind his partition. The official office ledger remained open to today's date, with all numeric columns carefully ruled in crisp black ink. Grasping my writing instrument, I paused for the upcoming patron to enter via the main entrance, Nothing more needed to be disturbed in this office today. I set the pen back into its wooden groove on the polished desk surface. A single brass key rested quietly beside the heavy glass inkwell on the corner of the wood. You might expect a grand finale when you choose not to strike. There was no applause at all. The morning sun hit the front porch boards differently. I sat at the wooden table without opening any book. The dark cloth cover stayed locked inside the lower drawer. Heavy and untouched, the brass key stayed inside my jacket pocket. Garrett stayed back in his room, quiet behind closed panels. Hollis walked past with his empty coal hod, nodding once without stopping. We owed nothing to each other now. You do not need to ruin someone to know your own worth. Sometimes, letting the page stay blank is the only victory that matters. The silence in the room carried a different weight than before. It felt steady. Across the kitchen, the small electric radio played a faint country song from 2 rooms over. My cup of coffee sat untouched on the counter, slowly going cold in the quiet morning air. Life simply went on outside, far away from any ledger.